How are you? You
I'm
look,
in the sun. I'm good. I'm
man.
so happy to join you. So happy to be in this collective of Indigenous power, celebrating you as a uniter of Indigenous people, as a longtime advocate and Indigenous rights activist. I'm so grateful and honored to be a part of this forum.
Uh, Thank you, Moneka. Just one caution. Don't try to. Yeah, because like I can easily yeah, get very cocky, like when people throw all these words at me. So like I had to always have to like watch myself, like stay humble. It has brought me into some very problematic situations. But thank you so much, 100%. Thank you so much
um,
for saying that and being with us.
I'm
Sorry.
so I'm so it was such a beautiful thing to follow up with Brandon's conversation, being from
Mm.
the Chamorro homelands in Guam and in the Northern Marianas. We have a very direct connection to the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii, who are also fighting for sovereignty against the U.S. Their imperial machine, and especially in the face of militarization. We share a lot of common struggles, and hearing from him and all the beautiful things that the Hawaiian nation is doing definitely empowers me and uplifts the my hopes for a demilitarized and a decolonized Pacific, especially those who are affiliated with the United States.
Um, um, I, to the people that do not know, I think. Thank you so much for highlighting that. Um, for the people that do not know, like the current state of militarization in Guahan and yeah, in that region, because I
Give a
think that
little
not a lot of
update
people.
and overview.
Yeah. Hmm.
Sure. So, Guam and the Northern Mariana Islands have been U.S. territories. Guam has been a U.S. territory since 1898, and then the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas was a trust territory after World War II. Um, and we are one archipelago and one people, but we have been politically separated since 1898 when Guam became a United States territory after the U.S.-Spanish War. At the same time, the Philippines did, and Cuba and Puerto Rico. And the Chamorro people have actually were the first people in the Pacific to have contact with Europeans. Next year, 2021, is the 500th anniversary of the quote unquote discovery from Magellan. When he was also attributed to the first circumnavigation of the globe, and that's also the commemoration year for that. So we were the first peoples to be victims, I guess, of the colonial enterprise. And we, in Guahan most specifically, have not had sovereignty since then. And in the American campaign here has always been military centric. We have 3 bases right now. We host an Air Force base and we host a Navy base, both, and they just activated the new Marine base in northern Guam. So about 30% of our lands are used for the war enterprise, for these training bases, for these housing bases. And now the military is also wanting to expand to create a firing range on one of our most sacred sites of Tailalu over the area of what's known as Retidian, which is a wildlife refuge. And those sites are also really important to us as a people because they sit over our northern lens aquifer, which supplies about millions of gallons of water every single day to about 88% of the population here. And we really worry about the contamination from the lead poisoning of the weapons training that will happen at these live fire ranges. And we also are just devastated at the impacts of the of these construction of these ranges because they destroyed some of the last pristine limestone forests for our islands. We also have one tree. It's the only mature mother tree of that kind that's going to be about only 100 feet or 100 meters away from one of the largest machine gun machine gun ranges, and it's just devastating to see that last tree might not survive because of all of the destruction around it. And just recently, we have been doing comment drives so that fishermen, they're going to be shutting the waters around those ranges when those ranges are in action, and it's just going to cut off more resources to our people, because outside of all those 30% of our island, which is already cut off from local people, unless you have proper identification or passes, you can't go there to access things for our traditional livelihoods, like medicines, like woods for carvings, like the fish to feed ourselves, and on all those lands used to be pristine farmlands. So we have experienced a lot of violence upon our lands from war, and we also experience a lot of sickness in our bodies because of the violence and the trauma that our lands have experienced, and also the psychological and community the community impacts from all of that as well is something that we're still healing from and wanting and learning to heal from. And Indigenous knowledge and uplifting our traditional knowledge is the way forward in healing ourselves.
No, thank you so much for explaining that everything, because like if you talk to, for example, with all due respect to Brandon, everyone knows the situation of Hawaii, everyone knows the militarization of Hawaii, but not many people know the situation of militarization in Guahan and in Northern Mariana. So thank you so much for outlining that, explaining that. And because also when you talk about sovereignty, and you alluded towards it to the end, asserting indigenous sovereignty, how important do you think that indigenous knowledge is? You already talked about it a little bit. Can you unpack that a little bit, the importance of indigenous knowledge in terms of sovereignty? So I think I've been asking that question to a frozen screen, maybe, and now she's out of the whole thing. Oh, okay. So I'll have to do like quick monologue again. I don't know where yeah. So like the thing is with Hawaii, like Brandon talked about at length, and not at length, but like he can explain the situation of militarization in Hawaii and colonization. And there's so many indigenous peoples in the Pacific that are still suffering or having to deal with colonization and militarization. We talk about Guahan, you talk about Tahiti, you talk about Rapa Nui, you talk about West Papua, you talk about Maluku, you talk like there's so many indigenous nations in the Pacific that are still having to deal with colonization and militarization. And I think that this conversation is also an opportunity to talk about that. So that's why I wanted Moneka to talk about that a little bit more, about the situation of Guahan, because I know that a little bit, but I don't know a lot, like at length and depth about it. And I know I can scratch the surface when it comes to Tahiti Nui, Rapa Nui, and Kanaki, and all the indigenous nations around the Pacific. But it's so very important that we expose. If 2020 is a year of exposing things, then it should also be of putting it out there, like the many political struggles of indigenous peoples in the Pacific, on their own terms, not having to go through CNN, Al Jazeera, or BBC, or I don't know, any kind of news outlet, but like at your own terms. Brandon alluded to it, talked about it, making use of social media, and there's no need for the middleman anymore. Whilst we getting back to Moneka, well, once again, luckily, otherwise I already saw Svetka like partially rolling her eyes, like, all right, there's this monologue again. But so thank you so much for getting back into the conversation. Yeah, so the question was in terms of, and by the way, just a quick a gentle reminder that our producer Svetka has a question for you as well. So whole new concept, bringing Svetka in a bit. So yeah, please continue with what you were talking about in terms of sovereignty and indigenous knowledge. And you're on mute at this point.
Indigenous knowledge is key, I feel, and I feel like this is a sentiment that was that I'm going to be echoing from a lot of your guests on how indigenous knowledge is key in the way that we move forward. And there's a reason why a vast majority of the world's biodiversity is under the stewardship of indigenous people, because we've been in our lands for so long. We have intimate connections to our lands, and we know how to be sustainable and have long-lasting good relationships with our animal relatives and with the waters and the waterways. And sovereignty will only thrive if we create systems that uplifts and acknowledge indigenous traditions and indigenous wisdom. And it's really important. I definitely echo the sentiments of what Brandon was saying earlier about how it's really important how we know where our food is coming from, and how we activate ourselves more to be growing our own foods more and growing in ways that are more in line with what our ancestors were doing. And following the moon cycles and following different protocols and rituals around that support that. And it's such a beautiful thing when we do that. And I hope to be doing that more personally over the next year. I created a cookbook that really highlights the ingredients of our islands. We have nice. on the islands here import 90% of our food, and that's just very dangerous when we think about climate change and when we think about future pandemics and when we think about war as well. Like, all these things that can cut off our food supply will really leave us in a vulnerable state in a way that we won't be able to nourish our people, and we'll be in a big pinch if we have to figure that out without making the moves months and years ahead of time to being more sovereign, at least within our food supply.
No, in terms of you talk about, you make that distinction between Indigenous people surviving and thriving. What is that element that goes takes you over from surviving to thriving?
So I feel like when we move beyond just the academic discourse of talking and like being in the headspace about indigenous knowledge and actually living it, and we are creating systems where our children from birth to death are involved in indigenous knowledge systems, like that's when it's thriving, when our languages are no longer threatened, when we are on a day-to-day basis doing things that our ancestors would be proud of and not really using our life energy anymore to fulfill the capitalistic norms and the dreams and riches of some other place and of some other people. That's when we're thriving, when we are really taking care of our resources. Here on the island of Guam, we have so many invasive species. We'll be thriving when we can bring our birds back. We're known for having the ecological disaster of bringing in a brown tree snake because of militarization, and that snake decimated all of our birds. I see us returning our lands to a state where we can have birds as something that's a marker for thriving for us here.
No, thank you so much for explaining that. Svetka, please come in. Like, this is first time that she actually would like to ask questions. So like, I'll really like to let her do that.
Oh wow!
Svetka's our producer. Svetka is our producer, so of the team. So go ahead, Svetka. You're on mute at this point.
Go ahead. Have a drinking game of all the times you've had to say that.
Yeah.
I'll be drunk by now.
Yes, for sure.
3 hours and 20 minutes by now, but
still very interesting to listen to all this. And when you were speaking, you gave me so many things to think about and so many questions because basically your islands, your culture, your society is, let's say, directly subjugated by the United States. And you're not the only one, of course, but unfortunately, not a lot of people know about this situation. I myself am from Europe, and I know that this is not really something that is common knowledge. But anyways, there are other societies that are still fighting for their freedom. I don't know if you've heard today on Human Rights Day, the United States decided to recognize Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara, which is also a huge blow to that region, in exchange for them recognizing the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So it seems like this international law and human rights are more and more becoming a trade-off for politicians for their own personal interests and all this. We could for sure talk about this for hours, but just a very quick question because we have a next person on the line already. I was going to ask, like, what are your strategies to talk about this and to demand your rights and your sovereignty with the American government concretely? Like, what are you doing about it?
The Chamorro people have been appealing to the Fourth Commission of the UN decolonization for years now. We're one of the Guam is one of the last remaining non-self-governing territories, and we've used that avenue for so long. But one of my personal strategies as an educator and as an activist is really just to build the community conscious around the issue because of colonization. We're not learning about our own history. We're not really understanding the full breadth of what colonization has done to us and many other people, and we're not connecting to a lot of indigenous peoples in ways that are meaningful. So one of the strategies that we've been employing is just really creating spaces where indigenous rights and indigenous rituals are safe and are practiced, and wanting to learn and connect more to the indigenous people in our region and within Micronesia is really important too, and uplift our relationships there, because as colonized people, we've internalized the harm that have come to us, and we've inflicted it upon our other island brethren, and healing those relationships and even just and starting from there is really important as a strategy. Is really building our community locally and trickling out to our region is where I feel I would be most effective and would be most effective for us in this short time, and then in long term, so continue to build international pressure through the United Nations forums.
Yeah, that sounds really good. And I was just thinking about what you were saying before, Ghazali, that and you mentioned it as well, the list of non-self-governing territories, there's still 17 countries or territories on it, and it would be great if after 2020 we could work towards clearing out that list. It would be a good fresh new start if we were like 50 years or 60 years after the beginning of decolonization process be finally done with these issues. So let's hope that there's some progress on that front. Definitely, I would love to talk to you more about this later. Unfortunately, we need to move on to our next guest, but I'm very interested into this topic to discuss it
Thank you
more.
so much for having me on. I look forward to learning more about all your upcoming guests and ways that we can connect and deepen our connections.
Yes.
Susmati, happy birthday.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being on the show. Although, yeah, it is such an amazing experience already.